So this isn't necessarily a scary story in the traditional sense of the word. It's more so to enlighten you on what we as troops had to deal with and some of the things that affect us negatively. More of the psychological side of things, I suppose. For context, I was in the Air Force for 10 years, from 2013 to 2023, so quite a while. I was working in aircraft maintenance, which makes you think, oh, you're just working on aircraft, you don't see anything crazy. I understand the thought process, but you're wrong. If you know, you know. Security forces understand too. Apes together strong. The physical effects of being in the military with a laborious job are pretty awful on their own. You have an abnormal amount of wear and tear being inflicted on your body that seems to age you expeditiously. Military years are equivalent to dog years. You can be in your 20s and you have all the bodily pains of an elderly person. Your joints tear themselves apart like two forks shredding pulled pork. Your bones feel stiff. Your muscles are knotted and strained constantly. Your hearing fades out, only to be replaced by the shrill, high-pitched ringing that drives you mad. Freedom rings every day when you have military-grade tinnitus. You're always tired, exhausted even, but you push through because the mission takes priority. I'm 29 and I feel like a dying 87-year-old. All of that is bad enough, sure, but the more taboo side of things that is scarcely talked about is the mental side of it. The military beats you down in every context. To start off, you're shipped away to a place you've never been, with people you don't know, and for many of us, it's our first time away from home. You're taken out of everything you've ever known, put in a place where you're screamed at constantly, you're sleep-deprived, you're physically exhausted, and you're constantly on edge. Looking back, boot camp wasn't bad, I'd definitely do it again, but in that time, it's a lot. I'll skip over the part about tech school, A school, or whatever the other branches call it. You're just there training for a few months learning your job, not too much to report there. For me, it all started to go downhill when I got my first duty station. I always heard jokes and saw memes about what it was like being a woman in the military, and I laughed. I thought that could never happen to me. Call me delusional, but my toxic trait is thinking that bad things that happen to other people won't happen to me, and I've been wrong every single time. 4 months into being stationed there, I had a breakup with my boyfriend of a year and a half. He told me that his dad died, ghosted for 6 weeks, and then reappeared. It turned out his dad was, and still is, very much alive. He just found another girl to cheat with. And so, John, if you're reading this, I hope you get hit on the ankle with a razor scooter. Lying about someone dying just to cheat is honestly disgusting. Pro tip, stay away from douchey military guys, ladies. Now, obviously, I was devastated. I had what thought was a good relationship with my coworkers, so when they noticed my change in behavior and asked what was going on, of course, I told them. I trusted these people. I thought that we were friends, but boy was I wrong. One coworker, a short, probably 5'5", I'm 5'9", fat, picture Danny DeVito as the Penguin, greasy, chain-smoking Hispanic guy decided that this was his chance to jump at the opportunity to shoot his shot, so to speak. Now I understand everyone's preferences are different, so don't come for me, but he is not what I would ever find attractive. I don't mind the height difference, I don't really care about that, but the rest, no thank you. Anyway, he started off by making remarks that I chose to ignore or laugh off, saying things like, "Your uniform fits you so well." And I would say, "Yeah, ABUs are great." Because while they're ugly, they're pretty flattering even if you're slim and mostly shapeless like I am. And he would make comments on my body, my hair, how hot I looked whenever I was covered in grime that came from the engine exhaust. I could easily ignore all of that because it's relatively hard to make me uncomfortable. But then he started texting me things like, "I bet you look so sexy naked," and "God, it would be amazing to see you riding me," etc. So I finally blew up at him, telling him that there's no chance in the world that I'd ever be with him. He disgusts me, and to not text me unless it's work-related. And I thought that was that. It was not. He was best friends with my supervisor and the other airmen in my shop. My supervisor refused to train me and pin paperwork on me, and my coworkers ostracized me, and they were rude. And so for the next 4 months, I only had one coworker on another shift that ever helped train me. and we ended up asking leadership for permission to pursue a relationship as he had a line number for a staff sergeant, and a lot of things happened prior to that, but it's not really all too important. Anyway, leadership, commander, chief, first sergeant, all gave their blessings and told us to keep it professional and on a need-to-know basis. Cool. All was well. Well, creepy coworker had suspicions that I was dating that coworker. I'll call him S. And so creepy coworker enlisted the help of his cohorts and ended up on a mission to ruin my life. And for months, they'd follow me around in their cars, follow me from place to place, taking pictures of me and where I was, Joe Goldberg style. I went to leadership about the stalking and I was told, "This is a very serious accusation and would require us to get local police involved. Are you sure that's what you want to do?" But it was said with the not-so-subtle undertone of, "We're not going to be doing that." And so I dropped it. It continued for a while after that. I was constantly on edge, paranoid, anxious, always scared because I didn't know if they'd try something physical, and I couldn't escape. I had nightmares, I had visual hallucinations when I was home alone, and I was just in a constant state of fear. I wasn't sleeping, I was barely eating, and I only left to go to work. I didn't even go outside if I didn't have to. I honestly wanted to take my own life because I just didn't know what else to do. I've been trying and trying to get someone to do something, but as one of the only 3 females in my unit, it was very much the good old boys club, so no one cared. And the final breaking point for me was when we were doing a job on the jet and I was replacing a valve. It's in a tight area, as most places on the jet, and creepy coworker then shimmies his way into the tight space under the guise of holding the ducts so I can put the clamps on the valve. This space I was in requires you to basically be what we call nut to butt, if you need a second set of hands. And so there he was, behind me, nut to butt, and I can feel his arousal. I finish the job, and then I go to the bathroom and just cry. After that, I just walked into the chief's office and told him what happened. First shirt comes in, and we all have to talk. We were in ISO back shop, and all creepy coworker and my dirtbag supervisor had ever talked about is how bad they wanted to go back to the flight line. And what did leadership do? They sent them to the flight line. They essentially rewarded them for their behavior. And then, that very same chief decided to slide into my DMs to try to solicit intimate activity in exchange for favors and money. Great. Another person who's meant to help guide you is a creep. I'd responded with, "Chief, you're older than my father and you look like Mr. Bean, and if you contact me with this again, I'll make sure your wife and your 4 children know all about it." He blocked me, and all of a sudden all of the reports I'd made magically disappeared. Later on, when S, my boyfriend, became financially, mentally, and physically abusive, that got swept under the rug too. I guess people just randomly have fractured orbital bones and bruises of hands around their necks. Silly me. And at no point at that time in my life did I feel safe, and again, I was very much on the verge of taking my own life. In December of 2015, I went on my first deployment. I was so excited to just get the hell away from that place. I went never having had flight line experience, but very willing to learn. And my supervisor there immediately was horrible to me, and I didn't know why until years later. That entire deployment was honestly pretty awful. While there, I met what would be another obsessed stalker in the future, but a much less threatening one. The only things that kept me sane that deployment were watching all of the jets take off, fully loaded, coming back empty, and all of the different aircraft from different countries I'd normally not see. The Antonov AN-225 being one of those. Rest in peace, big guy. The most stunning sunrises I've ever seen, and all of the kind, gorgeous Aussie men. Y'all are beautiful and so fun. I get back from my deployment, and things are okay for a while. I enter the E4 Mafia, and life as a senior airman was just a fun time mostly. I go to the flight line. I'm scared that I'll see dirtbag supervisor and creepy coworker, but they're in the other AMU. My deployment supervisor was my new supervisor, and remember, he hates me. Everyone excluded me and treated me as if I were a leper. I didn't know why until I finally got so frustrated and asked, and they told me that while creepy coworker and dirtbag supervisor were in the shop, they'd said that I can't take a joke, that I'd falsely accused them of harassment and stalking, and that I was a dumb bitch with an attitude. Eventually, I disproved that, and the shop became like a family to me. Okay, so all the perks of me being a woman are pretty much all explained. Now, moving on to the next section. In the military, it's often joked that you're not a person, you're just a number. And as far as I've seen in my time, that mostly rings true. I've seen someone fall off of a stand with an engine panel, referred to as a kneecap, and hit his head on the concrete. They asked if the kneecap was okay. Meanwhile, he was bleeding and ended up having a concussion. I've broken fingers, sliced up my arms, received many shocks and burns, concussions, etc. myself. Your physical and mental health typically doesn't matter to big brass. Their concern is the mission, the statistics. Knowing you're essentially nothing to anyone, a replaceable asset, it's very humbling. I'd finally had the big mentee B, as the kids call it nowadays, and I broke down and I finally called mental health because I was really going to take my own life this time. I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to wait for an off-base therapist for months. In the meantime, I spoke to my new chief about not going on this final deployment because I honestly was not in the place for it. My dad was basically on his deathbed, and I've been dealing with these ideations, and that several other NCOs wanted my slot. He said, "You're not an anomaly. You're not special. You're going." He also just generally didn't like you if you were white, so whatever. Anyway, I went on that last deployment, and I met my best friend. I had the worst time, yet also the most fulfilling time. I got into the gym after having COVID and losing a ton of weight, and I still had pneumonia, and that sucked. But I hit new PRs, I got muscular, and I had my best friend, and I was the trusted cat lady. We're not supposed to touch animals, but screw that. I love all of my deployment kitties. When I got back from that deployment, I got thrown on antidepressants. Turns out, they're ones they usually give people an inpatient to keep them catatonic, and I was on the highest dose. And needless to say, I no longer felt safe to work on aircraft because I'd be putting people's lives at risk, and I no longer felt safe being alone because if I got it in my head to actually do it, I would, just off myself. The only thing at the time that had ever stopped me was the fear of not knowing what happens after we die, and I'm very traumatized by religion, and I strayed away, so now I don't really know where I stand. And then my dad got COVID again, long COVID this time, and he ended up being on life support for over 6 months. I'm receiving calls from my mom saying that he may not make it through the night every other day, and I was feeling unsafe in my relationship. I thought he was going to kill me. I really know how to pick them, I guess. I was on a different antidepressant. I was drinking literally every day just to cope, and I had to be everywhere dealing with everything all at once. I was tired. I was done. They wanted me to PCS to another country. They tried to push, even though on paper I wasn't even allowed. I also didn't want to be across the globe having to spend $3,000 plus to fly back for what I thought would be my dad's inevitable funeral. I signed a form denying retainability because I knew in my soul that I didn't have another 6 years in me just to keep an assignment that I had once loved to go on. I lost my line number for tech, E6, but I wasn't too upset. I'm sure that there were other people that deserved that spot, and I had my airmen, which I lovingly referred to as my kids. They were and are some of the best people I know. I love those guys. They're in my family and my best friends. They're smart, funny, genuine, loyal, and driven young men, and I would do anything for them. They made my job easier, and I was like a rabid attack dog trying to keep those goobers safe and away from all the BS. Watching them grow up, climb in rank, become masters at their job, seeing them through their struggles. God, I'm just so proud of them, and they deserve every good thing that comes their way. They made my last 2.5 years the best that I've had in my life. And I'm sorry if this is all over the place. I just have completely untreated terrible ADHD. And on the topic of taking my own life and mental health, this is the leading cause of death in the military during maritime periods. We're burnout, we're taken for granted, we're numbers, slaves to the mission. Talking about your mental health is considered taboo, and seeking out mental help used to lead to repercussions that were pretty much a fast track to getting kicked out. Over the 10 years I was in, I can't count how many times people had taken their lives at one base that we had. Several of them were my good friends too, and one of them was my own troop. In a couple of weeks, it'll be 4 years. He'd been having some marital problems, dealing with a cheating, abusive wife who was also causing him financial strain. He was also better when he decided to divorce her based on my advice, but she weaseled her way back in. And when you love someone, you just give them too many chances. You'd think being in aircraft maintenance you wouldn't be seeing any dead bodies. Well, you're wrong. My troop and I had been working weekend duty mids, Friday to Monday, 2300 to 0700 for a few months. It was the best time. Then they got rid of the permanent weekend duty shift, so we went to regular mid-shift. One Sunday afternoon, I get a call from my supervisor asking if I'd heard from my troop, and I said no, and I tried to call with no answer. So I checked online, and it said that it was active. I'd seen a meme about dying that he'd captioned, "God, I wish that were me," and I got a terrible feeling, so I messaged him and tried to call him multiple times, and no answer each time. I report this to my supervisor, and I'm asked to be a runner and do a wellness check. I speed over and knock, and there's no answer. The door was unlocked, so I let myself in. The house is quiet, almost deafeningly quiet. And there, in his gaming room, he sat in his chair, slumped over. He'd taken his own life, a gunshot to the head. I can remember vividly the blood spatter and brain matter on the walls, the dried tears on his face, the fact that brain matter smells vaguely like cotton candy, sickly sweet, as they say. I don't know why, but it does, and I called my supervisor and the police. I made my reports with the police, I went home, and I just sat and cried. I had to go into work that night, as I was the only NCO, and when I got to work, my other troops asked where he was, and I'd said, he had something come up and he won't be in tonight. I wasn't allowed to tell anyone until the next of kin was notified, so I sent them out to the line, and I stayed inside and just cried behind my desk. That morning the commander announced it to everyone. That one was met by mutual shock and sadness, while one of the first ones was literally being joked about. People joking around that someone had taken their own life. Yeah, that shocked me just as much as I'm sure it shocks you. The second instance where I'd seen a body was my second deployment in 2017 to 2018. Now being in the Middle East, at night it gets very dark. We didn't have stadium lights on the flight line at that time, and they didn't have enough space for all the U-2s to be in the hangar tents. If you know what the U-2 Dragon Lady is, you know it's a small matte black aircraft with relatively low, thin, flexible wings. Anyway, on deployments, we have what are referred to as TCNs, third country nationals, doing contracted work for us, such as cooking, maintenance, shuttle drivers, etc., and we have a speed limit while on the flight line and near aircraft, and they don't ever remember that. This particular TCN was driving a small little van that can be best described as a clown car. It's very short and has fold-down seats in the middle, and you can fit at least 10 people in it. So he's driving, it's a nightmare, we're working across the taxiway, probably 170 plus feet, and he's speeding. Only problem is, there's a U-2 sitting right in his pathway. The little van lights were bright, and they're also too low to catch the wing. Well, before I can even yell for him to stop, he goes right under the wing, taking the top of the van off in the process. I sprint over, and after seeing what I was reacting to, so does a coworker. I was hopeful that he'd ducked and he'd be fine, but as I reached the van, I learned that wasn't the case. In the front seat was his body, while on the back was his head. I've seen cleanly dissected heads thanks to the UT's anthropology research facility, affectionately referred to as the body farm, but this was different. It's not clean, it's stringy, it's messy, the dangly bits of flesh, tendons, and torn muscle, the sickly pink yellow of bones and cartilage, the small hole that is your trachea, the blood still pumping out. The look on his face, eyes, and mouth open as I'm sure realization hit far too late. And God, what a way to die. As horrifying as it was almost like a sick fascination. We make our steps with the poor Aussie security forces and we go back to work. That U-2 had its first direct confirmed kill. Now, this story is already too long and it has too many side quests, so I'll just bring it to an end here. The military, even in merry time, can be a scary place. You experience a ton of trauma, you still get PTSD, your body figuratively disintegrates, and you see a lot of things. You go through a lot. They also don't tell you what it's like when you get out. Like you and your service don't really matter suddenly. How, for me at least, your entire adult life as you'd known it is over. You lose your family, you lose the structure, you lose your pride in your job, and you lose your sense of purpose. It's like you died and came back lost. The loneliness that comes with it, I genuinely can't put into words to make you understand unless you've been there. It's been almost a year since then and I still feel that way. You're never prepared for that. I regret getting out sometimes, a lot actually. And as horrible as the military has been in my time, it's also been amazing, giving me people who are my chosen family that I'll share a bond with until we die. One has, and I miss him more than anything. It was the best worst decision I've ever made in my life, and I'm sure others out there will have worse experiences than me, and I'm sure others out there will have better experiences. But if you've never been in the military, you don't have the right to discount our struggles and PTSD just because you haven't been in an active war zone. Every branch deals with the same BS in general.
You all probably know about the new generation of My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. It has, for one reason or another, became an overnight sensation. Whether or not you like the show yourself, you have to admit that its success is impressive. However, it raises a question. Lauren Faust has worked on other popular shows, and has been working on her own line of toys, the Galaxy Girls. How did she wind up creating the remake of some 80s toy commercial instead of working on her own show ideas? It could be that she's just nostalgic about her child My Little Pony toys, or something. But even then, what artist wouldn't rather work on their own ideas? I read this news story a few years ago. It was about 6 girls who all went to the same school and died on the same day, November 7th, 2004. A friend of mine from NC sent me a news article from the small local paper. I forgot about it until I was watching a few episodes of My Little Pony and realized the main characters were surprisingly similar to the girls who died. I decided to look for that article again. The paper had either gotten shut down or I had misremembered the name, so I tried tracking down my old World of Warcraft buddy and asked him for the article. Turned out he happened to have the file saved on his computer. And I was right. There's a definite connection here. The first girl, Samantha Gales, was obviously the inspiration for Fluttershy. A shy, introverted girl. What her classmates didn't know was that she was constantly abused at home by her mother and stepfather. Her mother conceived her at the age of 15, and she blamed poor Samantha for ruining her life. This made Samantha self-conscious. When her stepfather moved in, this made the neglect worsen. Her stepfather never liked having to take care of Samantha when her mother was away, so he would lock her in the basement and leave her, sometimes for the whole day. Her mother tolerated this, and, as she grew, would hit Samantha for talking out of turn. When her half-sister was born, the abuse became considerably worse. She would be starved, forced to sleep outside, and sometimes beaten outright. Because she dressed in shabby clothes and had low self-esteem, she was often picked on by other kids at school. Her only friends were animals that she would rescue, which her family would make her get rid of. She committed suicide by overdosing on Valium. The second, named Janice Walters, was always one of the popular girls. She was rich, smart, beautiful, and seemed to live the charmed life. However, her parents argued constantly and were really only together for appearances. She was held up to a high standard, which made her a perfectionist. She wanted to be a designer and live in Paris, but her parents wanted her to remain in Carolina and marry a proper man, one of good breeding and high income. For the most part, her parents ignored her. Her parents' only concern was appearing rich and of high social standing, but in reality, her mother married her father because of money, and because he had accumulated so much debt, they were losing money fast. This is what got her interested in fashion initially, since she started making her own fashionable clothes to maintain the appearance of wealth. She died in a car crash when her mother and father got into another argument over money while he was driving. Her neck was snapped on impact, and she died instantly. She was clearly the inspiration for Rarity. Then there was Alexandra Matthews. Alex was a competitive girl. She always sought to be the best, especially at sports, track in particular. Her father always wanted a boy, and since her mother was declared incapable of having another child, he decided to raise her as if she was his son. In the end, though, she loved her mother and father, and was more than happy to play sports with her father. She excelled at them even. This made her popular, and by the time she was in high school, she was being sought out by athletic scouts from colleges all over the country. This made her try even harder. She had always wanted to compete in the Olympics. However, when she was 15, her mother, who had been told she could never have another child, had a son. After that, her parents didn't pay very much attention to her, which made her more determined to succeed. She ended up pushing herself so hard at track, she neglected her friends, her grades, and even her personal health. At one point, she became so desperate, she started taking steroids. What her and her family didn't know was that she had a mild heart condition that the steroids worsened. She was pushing herself so hard physically as well. She ended up collapsing during a match due to a heart complication. She died in hospital a few days later. In the show, Rainbow Dash seems the most similar. The girl most similar to Applejack, Jamie Sanders, was a farm girl, just like the character based off her. What the show didn't include was that her farm was run down, and her family was always struggling with money. She often worked odd jobs under the table to try help support her family. She had many brothers and sisters, and she was the second, which meant it was up to her and her brother to take care of the young uns. This meant she didn't have much time to hang out with her friends, or take any extracurricular activities, or even do her homework on most nights. She had an aunt, whom her family from Manhattan was based off, who kept offering to send money to support her mother and father. but they were proud and always refused. That is, until her father died of a heart attack in 2001. Her mother followed shortly after, having killed herself when she couldn't handle the pressure of taking care of all the children. They were taken in by their senile grandma, who was incapable of truly taking care of them. Jamie herself oftentimes helped out with other families' yard work to keep her family afloat. She died when she fell into a wood chipper. Pinkie Pie's inspiration probably has the saddest story. Catherine Jackson was a foster child and moved from home to home. Her birth father killed her mother and himself in a fit of rage when she was 5, and she could never quite settle into a good home. Some of the foster families who would take her in were merely interested in the financial support adopting a child would bring in, and would refuse to feed her or clothe her. Even when she was in a nice home with a good family, the old memories still haunted her, breaking her fragile sanity into a million pieces. She would have nightmares of her mother screaming and bleeding, and her father screaming for her, claiming to be after her next. By the time she was in high school, she completely snapped. She started to hallucinate and act out in class. Many of the other kids, and even teachers, assumed she was merely hyperactive and was trying to be funny. She would oftentimes paint and draw and write about fascinating things, and dressed in over-the-top clothing. All the while, her condition was getting worse and worse, the voices and images becoming more realistic and more demanding. She died when she jumped off a building, one of the voices having told her she could fly. What makes the last fact even more chilling is that Lauren originally designed Pinkie Pie to be a Pegasus, as seen in her early development sketches. The last, Twilight Sparkle's inspiration, was an A student by the name of Cynthia Little. She was held up to a high standard from a young age. Her older brother was always getting awards for her academic and athletic achievement, and she was held up to the same high standard. She ended up neglecting other facets of her life in order to make sure she got the best grades. For a while, this worked. Her parents were proud of her accomplishments and bragged to their friends about having not one genius child, but 2. That is, until a local private academy for the gifted started to become interested in her, among several other advanced students. She knew that this would be the best opportunity she could have to prove herself as the perfect child. But the pressure was high. She knew there were limited spots for new students, and she knew there would be a test and an essay required to get in. So she became a little desperate. She studied to the point where she could hardly eat and never sleep. As the test closed in, she panicked, and she opted to find an essay online to copy, and during the test resorted to cheating. When she was caught, her parents were horrified. She sank into deep depression and eventually hung herself to save herself the shame of being an imperfect daughter. You might be wondering now why Lauren Faust would be inspired to make a sweet children's show inspired by such depressing events. Perhaps she felt some odd need to give the girls closure, or perhaps to tell their story in any way she could. Think about it. In the show, Fluttershy is able to take care of animals she adores. Rarity is a successful designer with loving parents. Rainbow Dash is in fact a great athlete. Applejack has a successful farm. Pinkie Pie is happy with not a care in the world. And Twilight Sparkle was accepted into an exclusive school. Maybe, just maybe, she wanted to give the spirits of these girls what they always wanted. And I think they're happy.
After a terrifying encounter with a demonic entity in the woods outside of their home, two brothers find themselves under attack by dark and malevolent forces. With no place of refuge from torment, not even their own home, will they escape the wrath of a real-life nightmare they have unearthed, or will the darkness take them? This is the untold story of the demonic Shadow Man case that was experienced by brothers Tom and Tim Yancey. With the majority of my audience not being subscribed, please consider subscribing with notifications on, liking the video, and leaving a comment, as well as checking out one of hundreds of videos available on my channel. Thank you. Lake Worth, Florida, founded in 1913, the city plays home to the arts, boasting festivals, boutiques, music venues, and a historic theater. But amongst the songs, paintings, and acting, it is also the home to something evil that lurks just beneath the surface. In the late 1960s, the Yancey family called Lake Worth their home. Living near the mostly underdeveloped southern woods in the town at that time, brothers Tim and Tom, along with their father Sonny and mother Barbara, up until this point, had lived a rather quiet life. Tim would describe his childhood home as a very peaceful and remote place to live. It was fairly isolated and in the middle of nowhere. His mother Barbara was a beacon of light and joy, a woman who always had a diamond smile upon her face. His father was a stern man, a battle-hardened Korean War veteran, who then worked as a carpenter doing construction. Sonny suffered from PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of the war, and according to Barbara, was a totally different person when he came back. He had been a sergeant in charge of a mortar platoon during the war, and would very rarely speak of what had happened. Although both of the brothers later would recall that he told them a few different stories of his time there. One story, that following a battle, he had to arrange for mass graves to be dug, and for bulldozers to lay the dead to rest. While suffering with PTSD, Sonny tended to have a short fuse on his temper, but for some reason, this particular summer, it seemed to get inexplicably worse. Where the family lived was remote and surrounded by lush woods, and prior to being settled, the land where the house now stood had been heavily utilized during the slave trade, as well as being the home to numerous bouts of violence between warring Native American tribes. So with the combinations of the terrors of war and those experiencing persecution, over the years, these heavy emotions seemed to leak into the earth, and the woods in and of themselves seemed to become a beacon for darkness, almost as if the black hearts of those who perpetrated the acts still rested beneath the leaves, sticks, and stones of the forest floor. Playing together as brothers often do, Tim and Tom would spend much time within those very same woods, bonding, exploring, and having a great time. Sonny had built a fort for the boys to enhance their time spent out there, and at this time, Tom was 12 years old, and Tim was 7. One chilly fall day, as Tom ventured into the woods alone, as he approached the fort, he began to get an eerie feeling, as if someone or something was watching him. With his inner voice screaming, he bolted and ran inside the fort. As he peered through the openings in between the various boards and peeking past the cloth-covered windows, at first he saw nothing. But as his heart began to subside from beating out of his chest, he began to hear the crunching of crisp autumn leaves around him. And through the darkness of the boards, he sees a silhouette of a creature. Although the figure appears man-like, something tells him that it's not of this world. Tom, doing the sensible thing, runs for his life, leaving the fort behind. Terrified at what he had just experienced, he decides to not tell anyone about what had happened. As Tom ventures back to the house, disturbed by what he had been through, Tim had entered through another path in the woods, blissfully unaware of his brother's plight. As the boy walks the crispy path of dried leaves, he too begins to feel as if he's being watched. Then in front of him, up in a tree, he sees something strange, something out of place. There in the tree, with the environment reacting around it, there appears to be some kind of creature. But this creature is either see-through, or it's reflecting its surroundings, almost like a freakish distortion of reality, perhaps something that shouldn't have been within the confines of our reality. As his eyes grow larger with fear, this entity begins to make its way down the tree, and then lands in front of him, mere feet away from the boy, hitting the ground with a loud thud. This is enough to truly frighten the young man, and he too, similar to his brother, decides to run for the house, the one place a child should feel safe to be. Tim frantically makes his way out of the woods and quickly into the arms of his mother, who was near the front door of their house. After explaining things as best as he could, Barbara calms him with the love only a mother can provide, asking him to calm down. She tried her best to convince him that it was perhaps an animal that he had startled, and that things would be okay. And although she did what she could, as we'll come to see, this would be far from what would take place. The brothers in due time would discuss the strangeness of their experiences in the woods with one another, confiding in each other, and trying to make sense of just what this thing or what these things were. Fearing that even talking about it could prompt a visit, the boys did their best to move on and shift their focus to other activities, fearing that if they spoke of it, they would invoke the wrath of what they began to call the Shadow Man. During the day, things seemed to regain a small amount of normalcy, but at night, the brothers began to see the very same figure outside, usually near the tree line, presenting a thick, man-like shadow, always watching and lurking like a wild animal stalking its prey. One night, as the moon peeks through the clouds overhead, Tim is jolted awake out of a sound sleep. With his eyes opening and slowly adjusting to the darkness of his room, he tries to make sense as to why he was suddenly woke up. As he glances towards his window, with the faintest amount of moonlight illuminating the room, he sees a shadow go past. Scared, but getting up to investigate, he reluctantly looks, and he sees nothing. Thinking that perhaps his mind is playing tricks on him, Tim lays his head back down to try and sleep again. But as he gets comfortable, right before he closes his eyes, he again sees this menacing shadow pass by his window. Attempting to wake up his brother, but unable to do so, he once again gathers the courage to take a look through the window, peering around their yard and towards the tree line. There in the mists emanating from the woods, he sees the shadowy outline of a man, and this man appears to be staring directly into his soul from afar. It then suddenly begins to rush towards him. Absolutely petrified with fear, the young man lets out a blood-curdling scream. His brother quickly wakes up, and so do his parents, with Sonny being the first inside the room. He asks just what is happening. After being told by Tim that there was a man in the yard, he quickly grabs a flashlight and begins sweeping the property. He ultimately would find nothing. Several weeks later, as the boys slept in their room, 12-year-old Tom starts acting strangely. Waking up to the sound of footsteps, Tim sees his brother in the middle of their room. As he calls out to him, he receives no response, and Tom then begins to walk and leave their room. Calling out to their parents as well as his brother, Tim continues to follow him as he descends the stairs, headed towards their front door. With Sonny and Barbara rushing close behind him, they watch as Tom heads out of the front door and into the yard. As Tim would describe it later, it was as if he was being called out to something, or there was something drawing him into those woods. It was very frightening for me, because I knew there was something out there, and I didn't understand why this was all happening. Sonny is able to wake the boy up as the four stand in the yard. Tom seemed to have been sleepwalking, unaware of what was taking place. Although this hadn't happened previously, and was completely new to the family, this incident would be far from the last. For the next several weeks, Tom would continue to sleepwalk. At times, with other members of the family unaware that he was missing, Tom would find himself waking up next to the lake, out in those foreboding woods. To try and keep the boy from sleepwalking, his parents began to implement measures to keep him from leaving the house. Frustrated, and understandably so, having to get up late into the night, what soon became night after night, with Tom often able to maneuver his way out of locked rooms, they took to stacking chairs in front of the boy's room, in hopes that this would prevent Tom from escaping and potentially hurting himself under one of his spells. Later that night, after the family had gone to bed, Tom took to waking up as per usual. As he aimlessly tries to unlock the door to their room, he wakes up Tim. Fearing that his brother would wake up their father, he tries to get him to wake up and realize just what he's doing. And while this is taking place, the closet door directly across the room from Tom begins to shudder, and then it opens by itself. Then, as if he was being controlled like a marionette puppet, Tom would turn around, face the closet, and then walk inside. Then, with the boy inside, the door would shut behind him, once again seemingly by itself, as if it were operated by unseen hands. Tim, scared but also transfixed on what was taking place, began to hear a conversation. He heard his brother speaking, then he heard another voice, a low, gravelly, deep voice. This frightens the young Tim so bad that despite his fear of his father, he calls out to his parents for protection, and thankfully, his parents heed the call. As they rush to push the chairs aside, they finally do, and then throw the door open to find out just what had happened now. Tim, pointing to the closet, indicates that Tom is inside. Heading to the closet door and opening it, they find the boy sat down inside now, apparently awake. Upon asking him just what was going on, all Tom could say was that there was a man in here. In later interviews, Tom would say that he remembers waking up inside the darkness of the closet to the voice of a man, and then upon speaking with him, towards the back of the closet, he saw two red eyes staring back at him. Despite knowing of their son's sleepwalking, his parents tried to argue that he was clearly messing around in the closet, possibly playing with toys. They then scolded both of the boys for waking them up, yet again. In the weeks to come, as their parents grow increasingly angry, the Yancey brothers continue to experience the abyssal force that they have come to refer to as the Shadow Man. One night, the entity seems to find a new way of terrorizing the brothers. Tim has suddenly woken up when he begins to feel small things hit his comforter and mattress. Feeling where the objects had fallen, his hands discover rocks like small pebbles, and thinking it was his brother messing with him, he asked him to stop and then laid his head back down onto his pillow. And then more of them started falling, pelting the blanket that covered him. He now knows for certain it is not Tom, because he's looking directly at him, and he is fast asleep. As the rocks continue falling onto him, he then discovers leaves, and then pine cones as well. Then he feels something drop onto his head, and this something begins to crawl. Prying off whatever this thing was and throwing it, the boy begins to scream. Barbara soon comes to his aid, and upon turning on the lights, she too finds the stones, pine cones, leaves, and to her surprise, giant Florida cockroaches. It was as if the Shadow Man was bringing in things from the woods, but for what reason remained unclear. It was with this incident that Barbara began to notice that perhaps it wasn't just the boys' imaginations at work. Perhaps there was something terrorizing them. In the weeks that followed this incident, Barbara too begins to notice the ever-growing hostile environment within the home, and soon begins to seek answers from any and all sources. While her husband is at work and her children are at school, she purchases a Ouija board, and upon returning home, places it on the coffee table in the living room. Not being into the occult previously, she doesn't really know what she's doing, but wants to do her best to communicate with whatever could be there, and to try and seek answers as to why it was tormenting her family. She tries to make contact, but doesn't receive any answers. Later that day, the family retires to their beds to catch some sleep. Little did they know of Barbara's attempts to contact the other side, and little did they know that hell was about to be unleashed upon them. As everyone drifts off to dreamland, Tim once again finds himself being woken up out of a dead sleep. Perhaps it was his intuition. It's hard to know for sure why. But as he wakes up and sits up in his bed, he sees a dark hand emerge from the closet in their room. As the familiar fear grips him, he gets up and shakes his brother Tom awake. And to Tom's disbelief, as he looks ahead where his brother is pointing, he too sees the hand. And then a more fuller figure begins to emerge from the closet opening. Before both of their eyes, a shadowy figure emerges, casting itself onto the wall, with glowing red eyes staring at them. It begins to climb horizontally on the wall towards them. With the brothers absolutely shaken to their core, they scream for their parents as the figure dissipates, as if it was never there. The two then rush out of their bedroom and run up to their parents' bedroom. And although apprehensive because of their father, they would rather deal with his wrath than that of the Shadow Man. Doing a knock and then opening their door, Tim leads the boys and calls out to their parents. He tells them that the man was back and that he was on their wall like a fly. This bizarre statement from his son and the continuous lack of sleep prompts Sonny to explode. He tells the boys that there is no man, that they're dealing with the boogeyman, and that the boogeyman does bad things to bad kids, and if they were good, he would simply just go away. With tears in his eyes, Tim and his brother would make their way back to their bedroom. Tim would later recall, this notion that I was a bad kid, that I had done something wrong, and that something had come to punish me for my misdeeds, is something that has stuck with me my entire life. I didn't know what I had done to deserve this. From that point on, the boys keep silent about the nightmare experiences that they had had with the entity known to them as the Shadow Man. But the entity seems to grow ever stronger. But even though they have been silent, the rage that dwells within their father, Sonny, also continues to grow. Tim later again would say, he seemed to not understand what was happening in the house, and this led to a lot of family dysfunction. Whether this attracted whatever this thing was to us, or it fed off of the negative emotions, or whatever, there was some kind of connection there. These entities seem to do this, and it's like a coupling. The entity attaches itself to a family, and then continues to cause problems, and seems to derive energy from this. As time passes, the boys find themselves awake on the night of Christmas Eve. Being rambunctious kids as some of us were, they decided to sneak downstairs to take a peek at some of their Christmas presents under the family tree in the living room. The boys seemed to be successful, not alerting their parents to their sneaky endeavors downstairs, when suddenly, loud booming knocks begin to come from upstairs. Trying to figure out what could be causing it, they realize that they seem to be originating from their room. Downstairs upon their mantel next to the tree, their mother had set up a nativity scene showing Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus. As the banging intensifies further, the scene begins to shake and move. It then drops to the floor, shattering the porcelain figures. The breaking only adding to the cacophony of sound, now reverberating all throughout the house. Then the heavy footsteps of their father cuts through the noise. As he descends the stairs, the boys are trapped. He is pissed, and then he finds the shattered porcelain figures, and this further enrages him. As he interrogates the boys as to what they could have been doing, the boys deny causing the sounds or breaking the figures, but this too only serves to deepen his rage. Since the boys, quote, wanted to stay up, they could do so outside. Using a scare tactic, he marches the boys outside and into the yard, right near the tree line of the forest. He tells them that he was going to get a good night's sleep, and they were to stay outside all night. Little does he know, he has inadvertently delivered his sons into the arms of perdition. The air is cold and bites at their skin as a large moon hovers above them, and the low rustle of leaves surround them. The two young men, despite their best efforts to comfort one another, are absolutely paralyzed with fear as they stand in the darkness of the night. They both suddenly hear the crunching of leaves from behind them. Upon turning around, they are besieged by the Shadow Man yet again. Screaming for their mother as they run up to their deck, they beg to be let back into the house. Finally, their mother is woke up and forces their father to come with her and let the boys back in, finding the punishment to be cruel, especially since she knows herself that there are things at work that none of them understand. Tim would later say this when interviewed: "My father's anger continued to grow, and he became increasingly frustrated. He would blame the noises on us, and his punishments were severe. The goal of this monster seemed to be to create more anger, more chaos, and more depression within our family." The situation grew bleaker day after day. And on a cold and stormy night, as Tim laid in his bed, he was all too familiarly woken up, without warning. This time, however, something was different. His sheets and blankets were pulled from him. And as Tim would later say, "You know something's there. It's in the room with you. And you've got to reach down and pull those sheets back up." The boy reaches down to do just that, peering down as he grabs them off the floor. He thankfully doesn't see anything. Pulling them back over himself, now laying back down, he once again tries to get comfortable to sleep. As he starts to drift off, he then feels a sharp, searing pain on the right side of his ribs. Feeling this pain, his eyes pop open to find what appears to be a long, bony hand coming from underneath his sheets. Scared for his life, the boy screeches and runs as fast as his legs will carry him. But being this scared, he had his blinders on because he ran directly into the door that was locked to try and prevent his brother from sleepwalking and ultimately leaving the house. He smacks into the door with a visceral crack, screaming in pain and crashing to the ground. This prompted the attention of his parents, who came into the room to discover their son writhing in agony. They would quickly rush him to the hospital, and it would turn out that Tim had broken both of his collarbones. Following this event, as the months turned to years, things from here did not get any better for the Yancey family. Tom, being the oldest, when he became old enough, left the house as quickly as he could, no longer able to deal with the dark forces that dwelled there. Tim, Sonny, and Barbara would not see him for years. Details past this point are practically non-existent, but I will do my best to bring a conclusion to this very haunting case based on what I could find. Over the next 30 years, Tom would play college football and then become a career firefighter. Tim, given all the experiences he experienced before and after his brother left, would become a paranormal investigator and a park ranger. Drifting apart as people do, they wouldn't reconnect until after their parents were gone. Sonny and Barbara had continued to live at the same house the two had grown up in and had had all of their Shadow Man experiences. When the brothers inherited the house, they came back together to decide just what to do with it. Tom, who had done practically everything to never return to the house, would later recall that he had a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach upon entering the house again, saying that it was just an evil, sickening feeling. As the brothers discussed things, it would become apparent that Tim wanted to move back into the home with his wife and reclaim it. So after working out a deal amongst themselves, that's exactly what Tim did. And by moving back in, he intended to cleanse the home, to rid themselves once and for all of this ominous presence that had caused them so much pain, the entity they knew as the Shadow Man. Prior to moving in, Tim would reach out to his friend Roy Hall, who had dealt with violent hauntings for many years, to help him perform a cleansing ritual of the home. Roy believed that the entity was demonic in nature and haunted the family because Tim's father was abusive. Sonny, who was a Korean War veteran, probably saw a good amount of the horrors of war. He believed that because of Sonny's PTSD, that perhaps the entity had been attached to the land and had seen this and exploited these problems as an entry into their lives, where it continued to wreak havoc upon all of them. As Roy would say in later interviews, these entities seek to cause further dysfunction. They feed upon it. The two men on a rainy and dreary afternoon would step into the home together. Roy would begin to pick up on the ominous, thick atmosphere almost immediately. Lighting incense and beginning various prayers, the two men go from room to room, cleansing. As they walk throughout the house, they sense that the presence is strongest in Tim and Tom's old room. calling out to God to cleanse the house of all evil and negativity. The process took about an hour, but following it, the energy in the house seemed to be rid once and for all of the Shadow Man. Tim recalled that things felt different. They felt much lighter, as if we had displaced the negative energy within the home. In August of 2009, Tim, his wife Trish, and son Gabriel all moved into the Lakewood, Florida home. Although they never experienced anything to the degree the boys did while growing up within it, there still seemed to be an undercurrent of evil just right below the surface. In closing, it is believed that the dysfunction of the Yancey household was more than likely far worse than what the sons portrayed publicly, but to what extent, I'm not sure. I did my best to dig as deep as I could, and I believe Tim and Tom are both still alive, with Tim still being a consultant to various paranormal groups across the country. I did want to say that their story was a terrifying and a harrowing one, and although somewhat anticlimactic in the end, as we know here on this channel, things don't always work out the way we want them to, and cases don't always have some kind of ultimate showdown. But a few questions I was left with after researching this case were, just what was the Shadow Man? Was it a demon? Did it exploit the vulnerabilities of the family, particularly Sonny, in order to create a feedback loop of negativity in which it could enrich itself with? And although from the outside looking in, those that are still with us who were involved seem to be doing okay, but just how has surviving the haunting affected these two men on a daily basis? Do they still think about it, as I occasionally do, with my own experiences? All questions I may never have answers for, but one thing is certain. There was something evil that stalked the woodlands surrounding the Yancey home. Something stalking like a predator, seeking prey. And although things seem to be dormant for now, these malevolent entities may still be watching and lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to strike. Don't let their victim be you. Thank you guys so much for watching this new video. Please let me know what you thought down in the comments below, and if you have any particular cases that you'd like me to research and cover, let me know. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe with notifications on, and consider checking out the YouTube membership program and/or supporting me on Patreon. Or if you'd prefer to have something cool and in your hands and want to help support the channel as well, consider purchasing my book, Stories from the Archives Volume 1, from either my Shopify store or Amazon. Other than that, guys, numbers are still down, but we are very slowly but surely on the way back up as far as I can tell. So to everyone who has supported me and the channel and has been regularly watching, interacting, and sharing, thank you guys so much. You're all the best. Anyways, guys, new and limited merchandise will be coming your way very soon, and I appreciate each and every one of you. This has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Remember to please stay safe out there, and take care. I'll see you next time.
"9 years ago, I had met a person that, to this day, I still wish I never did. I was an isolated, bullied, and depressed 8th grader, with the added state of being a plus-sized kid in a sports-centric town, and so basically, I was beaten and ridiculed on a daily basis. I couldn't make any new friends with my classmates, and all of my old friends from elementary school got placed in different classes, and nobody was in the same after-school groups as me anymore. We were also in a scout group, but that disbanded before I got into middle school. I was also lonely that if someone talked to me without picking on me, it made me happy. I had a Google Plus account, the only social media I could get access to at school that I kept hidden from my parents, and that I would use to check out my favorite fandoms and hopefully use to make some new friends. One day I was on Google Plus in the computer lab, and I had commented under a piece of fan art of a character I liked. The person who made the post had replied to me not even a minute later. I remember getting very excited seeing that notification, my heart swelling up in excitement. The two of us spent the next 10 minutes of my class talking to each other in the comments section, and we ended up replying so much we flooded a good portion of the comments with our talk. After I changed classes, I logged back into one of the Chromebooks that we had stored in the back of the class and saw that she actually messaged me. Her name was Haley. At least, she told me that was her name. But years later, I'm not as sure that it was actually her name, and in the message that I got, Haley told me that she was 2 years older than me, and that we had a lot of things in common. I spent the rest of the school day on my phone, not giving a damn about anything in my classes. We talked for the next week in our DMs until she suggested that we move to a private chat room. Later that day, we created a private chat on an online messaging site, and in our first conversation, we initially just exchanged messages. Then Haley asked if we could also do a voice call. I told her I wasn't sure, but she said that it would be easier to hold a conversation that way. After she asked me several times, I eventually agreed. After an hour of talking, she then suggested that we video chat. I agreed, both to make sure that she was actually my age and also to put a face to the name. Haley turned on her camera, and she did look to be about in the same age range as me. I don't know why, but that fact haunts me more than anything else. The fact that she looked so close to my age and easily smiled and spoke so kindly made me feel like I had nothing to fear, and this led me to quickly believe that I could trust her. We ended up talking for hours after that, with me practically on cloud 9 the entire time having a friend. In the beginning of our friendship, things were going well. We told each other about our schools, our likes, and gushed over our favorite series. We talked almost every day, staying up late into the night, and we even exchanged some silly pictures of ourselves and shared memes back and forth. After we had been talking for about 6 months, Haley asked if I would like to meet her friends. At first, I was ecstatic. The thought of having some more friends excited me so much that I didn't think twice before saying yes. Haley invited me, and I got to meet her other friends. I had a completely different feeling about these people compared to Haley, though. Something about the chat room made me feel unsafe, even though they all seemed nice and Haley reassured me that I could trust them. It felt like my instincts were trying to warn me, but I wasn't sure about what, so I just ignored it. Most of them were much older than me. In the chat with her main friends, there were 6 other people. Most of them were saying that they were 18 or 19, but 2 guys were distinctly in their 20s. I asked how they all met, and they said it was either on another social media site or from real life, but they wouldn't answer any more of my questions. I was a bit naive, so all the red flags that were popping up went completely over my head. The calls that I had with them were pure chaos. From constant loud talking to frequently talking over each other. The messages were even worse, as they frequently used curse words and brought up topics that were not appropriate for a minor. I tried building genuine connections with them, but they acted dismissively toward me and seemed annoyed whenever I tried to join the conversation. Needless to say, I didn't like them very much. Haley, on the other hand, was all about them. She would pull the exact same habits, jokes, and use the same crude language as the others. They could say something incredibly problematic and she would laugh right along with them, and I was shocked by this version of Haley because she never acted like that when it was just the two of us. We still talked a lot, but gradually she started spending more time with her other friends than with me, and at first I thought this was fine. But the more she ignored my messages or didn't pick up my calls, it started to bother me. And when I called Haley to confront her about blowing me off, she went ballistic, saying that I was being selfish and that I didn't want her talking to her other friends because I was jealous. And I explained that that wasn't true, but she wouldn't listen and hung up to me. Haley then ghosted me for almost a month, leaving me worried and upset over what I may have done. When she started talking to me again, I was so emotionally distraught that I cried during our first call, apologizing for what I said last time. She told me it was fine, that she just needed some time alone and that she would talk to me more. And she did, although not in the way that I had hoped. Haley began telling me that she had depression, and that was the reason that she hadn't talked to me for a month. I didn't judge her and said that she could always come to me if she needed to talk, and this led to her dumping her trauma on me nearly every day, talking about how awful her home life was, her strained relationship with her mother, and how much she hated herself. I was also there to offer a listening ear and some kind words whenever Haley called or messaged me about it. This quickly became part of our routine. Almost daily, in the middle of any conversation, she'd start complaining about something that happened during her day. If it wasn't that, it was about how ugly she thought that she was and how much she hated her life and how she wanted to end things, quote-unquote. And that last part freaked me out the most. I was worried because we lived in different states and I couldn't help her in person. Every time she became self-deprecating, I would say otherwise, giving her compliments and words of affirmation for so long that my throat started to hurt and felt raw from talking. And then, just as quickly as she'd bring it up, she'd drop that conversation and we'd just continue on like before. Haley also began calling for long periods of time and messaging me late into the night. Phone calls would stretch on for hours, and her texts would come in until about 3 or 4 in the morning. The problem was, it was mainly her just talking now. During every phone call, she'd take over the conversation. If I didn't respond to her messages quickly enough, she'd just spam me with multiple texts faster than I could read them. And when I tried to end the conversations, Haley would chastise me for wanting to leave, reminding me that not long ago I had wanted her attention, and she basically would guilt-trip me into staying, and it seemed to work. Even if I had lost interest in our talks or didn't want her messaging me during class, I still let her talk and replied. At least I still had her attention, and she still wanted to be my friend. And this cycle went on for 2 years, and it left me feeling more anxious and exhausted than anything else. It felt like we had nothing in common anymore. She would either ghost me for a week or spend the entire weekend texting me nonstop. The topics about her self-worth also got worse. They escalated to her messaging me goodbye or I can't live like this anymore, and then not responding to any of my messages or calls. She would also send me pictures of her marking herself, describing how it felt. And the sight of those messages would send me into panic attacks, and I would end up in tears each time. The group chat with her other friends also got worse. Arguments broke out frequently, drama and gossip spread like wildfire, and people were blocked and unblocked almost every few days. I hated talking to them, and they began ganging up on me in messages, and Haley was often the first to make rude jokes about me, and they would all laugh. I grew sick of it and stopped messaging and calling both Haley and her friends, despite her begging me not to. One late night, while the group was arguing over text, I hit my breaking point. I was tired of all the drama and being treated like crap, so I messaged the group chat, telling them that I had enough, and privately messaged Haley that I needed a break. Then I left both chat rooms, blocked everyone, deleted my messaging account, and removed the site from my computer's history. And once it was all over, I felt like I had been freed from some kind of prison, and all I could do was cry in relief and euphoria that it was finally over. I later found out that all of the pictures Haley had sent me were stock images and photoshopped. After doing a bit of digging into her background, I learned that many of these things just didn't add up. She was actually a lot older than she had originally told me, at least 6 or 7 or 8 years older, and this meant that when we first met when I was 14, she must have been well over 20 years old. Many things from our interactions still haunt me, especially the pictures of her marks and her scathing, self-deprecating messages. For almost 3 months, I had nightmares about Haley getting back in contact with me and what she might say or do. I have much better friends now, and I am absolutely certain that I will never have to hear from Haley again, but sometimes I still wonder who that woman really was, and what it was about me that she found so interesting. Hopefully, I'll never find out. I recently went on a date with a guy from my school who I met on a dating app. He seemed very sweet and charming over text, so I agreed to go on a date with him, especially after 2 friends mentioned that they knew him from a class and said he was generally a funny guy. We attend a small but prestigious university, which also reassured me that he would be normal. He was supposed to meet me at 6 p.m. for a picnic, but ended up picking me up at 8:30. He had texted me to reschedule to 8 and ended up showing up at that time. He drove me to his apartment, and although I felt uncomfortable, I agreed to go in because of everything that I thought I knew about him. The apartment was dimly lit, with only one candle and a small glowing light on the floor, which didn't add much illumination. It was a multi-bedroom apartment that he lived in alone, which made it even more unusual. We talked and ate some food, and he seemed nervous and uneasy for most of it. Suddenly, he shifted the conversation to our deepest, darkest secrets and asked if I had ever seriously